This unit will begin by examining what is known as the Dark Age, and so
We begin with the rampant destruction, the catastrophe of not only Mycenaean civilization, but as you recall, the Hittite Empire will collapse. The city-states along the eastern Mediterranean seaboard will all be sacked and destroyed, and many of these sites will never be rebuilt, will never be inhabited. And that is our starting point as we settle into a dark age. Now, the Dark Age, we can kind of quantify it when we look at the archaeological evidence, and I've given you some data in the text of this particular slide. Again, about 1200 BC, we believe there were about 320 inhabited sites that have been found and excavated. If you advance the timeline by 100 years to 1100 BC, we're down to about 130 occupied sites. And if you advance the timeline to 1000 BC, another 100 years, we are down to 40 inhabited sites. So a lot of dispersal of populations, and certainly a lot of those old palace citadels will no longer be in use. And if they are going to be in use, it's going to be by squatters who are not interested in rebuilding anything, just mainly living at a subsistence level. Now, in recent times, archaeologists have kind of revised their estimates as to how quickly post-Mycenaean Greece recovered. And it actually looks a lot better than some of the earlier grim forecasts had led us to believe. And one of the trends that we note is that out on the periphery of the Mycenaean world, and again, if you'll remember, the Mycenaean civilization was centered along this peninsula here, the Peloponnese, where you had three of the main palace citadels located. And this, of course, is the area that will bear the brunt of the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. And it's not really a surprise then that the recovery itself, when it does occur, is going to occur out on the periphery of the Mycenaean world. And the areas that I have highlighted in yellow represent those archaeological sites that have been excavated that give us some idea that recovery from the collapse begins really around the late 1000s. So, around the year 1000, we are seeing signs of life again. And we're looking at, from north to south, the area here called Elatea. We have the Lefkandi area on the island of Euboea. And we have, on the Attic Peninsula, we have the area around Athens itself. And these areas, particularly the Lefkandi on the island of Euboea, I want to take a look at in some detail because they give us an indication that there were some lingering cultural components left over from the Mycenaean period that continued to define life and culture into the Dark Age for many Greek communities. Now, before moving into the specific communities themselves, I want to give you also a broad idea that when the Mycenaean world collapses, you get a vast amount of movement by the various peoples. Some of them are newcomers, and in your Martin text, he will talk about a group called the Dorians, which are believed to have descended from the very northern part of Greece down into the Peloponnese after the Mycenaean civilization had collapsed. And it is these Dorians who, according to legend, actually invaded, and archaeologists in the 19th century into the early 20th century actually believe that it was the Dorians who were responsible for the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. But that does not seem to be the case. Instead, the Dorians moved in when everybody else had moved out and simply occupied the areas of the Peloponnese that had been left vacant when Mycenaean civilization collapsed. So these Dorians, though, will contribute their dialect into as one of the three main linguistic dialects of the Greek language. And the Dorians are represented in my map here in green. That area in green will be inhabited by Dorian speakers. The other two linguistic groups, I'll take the Aeolians first. That is light yellow. Light yellow, and that is based out of the area called Thessaly here and Boeotia here. And in many ways, the most important linguistic dialect, the Ionian dialect, will be represented by the people living on the Attic Peninsula, including the Athenians, the island of Euboea that I've mentioned a moment ago. And this area of coastal Turkey, what is Anatolia, this area will become known as Ionia because of the large numbers of Ionian speakers that will migrate from mainland Greece itself across the Aegean onto the coastal area of Anatolia. And this area here, shaded darker yellow, will be called Ionia. The Dorian speakers, as we see in this bottom text area, the Dorian speakers will be comprised most prominently of Spartans, those people known as Spartans, while as the Ionians will be the Athenians. And I'm setting you guys up for later units when we'll look at the rivalry that will develop between these two great city-states, that of Sparta and that of Athens. So it begins with the dialect distribution during this Dark Age period. So as I mentioned, we are going to be looking at migration across the Aegean into coastal Turkey, into this area called Ionia. And this area called Ionia will, for centuries, be kind of the center of intellectual activity. We're going to get a lot of early scientific exploration, a lot of philosophical exploration coming out of this area, not in mainland Greece, but along coastal Anatolia. And one of the prominent city-states that will emerge is Miletus, but there will be others. So this area will be an extension of the Greek world, and a very important one that we'll explore a little later on. But this migration, again, comes out of this Dark Age period where there is a lot of movement of peoples throughout the broader Greek world. Now, when it comes to units of social organization, as I mentioned, there are no more Mycenaean palaces, and the type of unit that will be the basic building block for a revised Greek civilization will be the oikos, the household. And what we're looking at here is a very long structure, kind of a long house, in which an extended family will live, and the eldest male, the father figure, will be the head of the household. And over time, as households grow, as populations expand, as you get a merger of various of the oikoi, you're going to see these units develop into tribal units, and that again will be the building block for much of the Dark Ages. In our next unit, we'll look at what's called the Archaic Age and the development of what is known as the city-state. But right now we're still at that basic level where family, extended family, and then groupings of like-minded people will evolve into tribal units. So again, very basic when compared to the Mycenaean civilization. Now, that is not to say that you're going to get a flattening out of social organization. There still will remain a social hierarchy. And I mentioned a few slides ago about one of the sites that represents an early recovery from the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. That site is at Lefkande on the island of Euboea. And it's at this site where we see what you're looking at in the top left image here is one of those long houses that I just described as being kind of the structure used by the oikos. Well, this type of structure was used as also a burial chamber. And within, where I have my circle here, my red circle, within this longhouse structure, we will see two graves. One, I'll begin here on the very right of my slide. There is the burial remains, cremated remains of a male, surrounded by various tomb goods, including a sword, that led us to believe that he indeed was a chieftain, a warrior chieftain, if you will. His body had been cremated, but we know from the bones that it was male. Next to the cremated remains of the male are the remains, not cremated, but the physical remains of a female. And next to these burials, we see three horses that had been sacrificed and buried alongside the male and female remains. And this leads us to believe that this was a type of heroic burial. One of the things that we'll be looking at a little later on in this unit is the epics, Iliad and Odyssey. And in the Iliad in particular, there is a moment where the hero Achilles, in honor of his dead friend Patroclus, will sacrifice animals and human beings in honor of his dead friend. And that is kind of the exemplar of a heroic burial. Well, what we have here at Lefkandi may indicate that there is a lingering social stratification in which clearly there were some chieftains who enjoyed greater status than anybody else in the community, and therefore when they were buried, there is speculation that the woman herself was killed, as a kind of honoring of her husband, if indeed that was her husband. So we do get a sense that there is this heroic ideal alive and well in the Dark Age, and that will set us up for what we'll look at in the next section of this Unit 2 lecture, the development of the heroic epics, upon which perhaps this gives us some evidence. The Lefkandi burial gives us some evidence that some of these practices were actually carried out by the Greeks during the Dark Age period.
Now, there is another aspect of these heroic burials that we should note, and that is the process by which the memories of these heroes was kept alive.
And as I mentioned, because during the Mycenaean period, Linear B was the primary script, and that was very limited, oral composition of epic poems was a part of kind of the entertainment network of even the Mycenaean period. This will continue on through the Dark Ages, as even Linear B itself is lost to the Greeks. They will rely heavily on oral composition,
until after commerce begins picking back up again, and the Greeks will take to the sea and will ultimately be exposed to a broader cultural environment. Now, we see, of course, Greece located here, and over the course of their journeys, the Greeks will settle in Ionia, that coastal part of what is now Turkey, and they will venture even further, and ultimately they will leave the Aegean and sail down into the Mediterranean, where they will be exposed to the Phoenicians, another seagoing people. And the Phoenicians had developed a alphabet, and the Greeks will use this alphabet. They will find it very handy indeed. The Greeks will have to adapt it. They will have to add vowels to it. But ultimately, they will gain the ability to write. And one of the first things that they decide to record via this new tool, this new alphabet, is the epic tales of the great heroes of days gone by.
Now, the greatest of these epics is attributed to one poet, Homer. And again, he is credited with creating both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And both of these poems are written down about 725 BCE. Both will consist of 24 books, and 24 books meaning, if we can imagine each book being a roll of papyrus, nowadays that would be about a chapter for us. So each of the epics is about 24 chapters long, Iliad and Odyssey. And both of these epics will detail the exploits of a heroic figure or heroic figures, in the case of the Iliad, certainly. So what we see is Homer himself, a lot of controversy surrounding whether or not such a figure existed. I don't want to get into that here. So what we'll look at is, in the Iliad in particular, is the Trojan War era. And this image, of course, you may remember from the Unit 1 lecture, describes or illustrates the broad-based participation of the Greek principalities during the Mycenaean period as they organize under the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon, to attack the city of Troy. And of course, the reason given in the Trojan story, the Trojan War story, is that the Prince of Troy, Paris, has grabbed the wife of the king of Sparta, Menelaus, who also happens to be Agamemnon's younger brother, and Paris has taken Helen back to Troy, and the Greeks want her back. Historians believe that if there was a Trojan War, Helen had nothing to do with it. It was an attempt by the Greeks to take the city, pillage it, and control that avenue into the Black Sea, that narrow channel called the Dardanelles. So, but of course, it's a good story, and certainly Homer tells it very well, exploring the heroic deeds of these great figures. And this itself is going to act as a type of code of conduct that will influence generation after generation of young Greeks, particularly those of the nobility, those of a class called the aristoi, a Greek word translating as the best. And the Homeric epics and the code of behavior that they describe is going to offer up a blueprint by which these nobles, who do most of the fighting, to demand for themselves a greater share of political power. And so their warrior behavior gives them legitimacy when they begin demanding more and more political power over their communities. And as we've seen in the last video lecture, the first part of Unit 2, is the tomb at Lefkande indicates to us that there was a lingering social stratification, in part probably based on warrior ability, if we get a sense of the tomb goods that were recovered. That we do get this sense that there's a heroic ideal alive and well throughout the Dark Age, and Homer's accounts of the Trojan War are based in part largely on generations of oral transmission of deeds that were done by actual warriors throughout the centuries of the Dark Ages. And by the time Homer gets a hold of these stories, he refines them, crafts them, turns them into a coherent epic, and they are written down, if not by Homer, somebody else roughly contemporary with Homer. But again, the point that I want to make to you is they offer up a code of conduct that gives the nobility, the aristoi, a legitimacy in why they are the rulers over the common folk.
Now, the context of both the Iliad and the Odyssey is the Trojan War. And what I'd like to do now is to present you with a summary of the Iliad to give you some idea of just what a masterpiece it is. Like any good epic, Homer's Iliad begins in medias res, in the middle of the story. The author, in this case Homer, would assume that his audience had a basic knowledge of the events leading up to the moment where he decides to begin the story, and so we are thrust right in the middle of the action, and right away we are informed as to what the theme is that's going to be driving this story. And the theme is that the most formidable of the Greek warriors, Achilles, has been aggrieved by his king, Agamemnon. Now, I should not say his king because, as I must point out, Agamemnon was king of Mycenae, but Achilles and Odysseus and Diomedes and and Ajax the Greater, all these guys were kings of their own
territories within Greece itself. Agamemnon, as king of Mycenae, had a special prestige. He was primus inter pares. He was the first amongst equals, meaning they were all technically kings, but everybody looked, certainly in this case, to Agamemnon for leadership. So Achilles has been aggrieved by Agamemnon, and he's angry about this. And the driving theme of the Iliad is the anger of Achilles and how it manifests itself in sort of a broader a series of events. But Achilles is angry at Agamemnon because his honor, his kleos, has been affronted by King Agamemnon, who has publicly declared his intention to take away Achilles' concubine, Briseis. Briseis was a war captive, a female war captive, and she was also a geros, a war prize, the top war prize that the Greeks would allot to whoever they think deserved the greatest prize. As you guys are probably aware, back in the ancient period, and you can argue that even up until today, war was often fought to acquire loot, to acquire resources. And back in the days of the Homeric warriors, that was a motivator, and depending on how well you fought and the prestige that your comrades held you in, would determine what kind of prizes or what kind of loot you would get, and that would reflect on your kleos, your honor, and Agamemnon has really committed a serious breach here, and we'll get into the heart of the story, but he does decide that he is going to take away Achilles' main war prize, the concubine Briseis, who has again been captured from a nearby village. And this affront to his honor is going to anger Achilles so much that he has publicly declared his intention to withdraw from the war, and he ultimately threatens to take his contingent of warriors, the Myrmidons, back to his homeland. And so right away we are thrust in medias res. We are thrust into a crisis that could derail the entire Greek attempt to take Troy, even after 10 years of war. So Achilles is angry at Agamemnon for taking Briseis. Now, what has happened here is a breach of Achilles' kleos by stripping him of his honor. And there are two interdependent concepts that we have to look at here briefly. Time, translated roughly as honor, is the tangible expression of honor in the form of loot or gifts. Okay, so Briseis, she is a war prize. She represents Time. And kleos means what other people are saying about you. Okay, we are dealing in the Iliad with these Homeric warriors. We are dealing with a shame culture, and a shame culture basically says that your self-worth, your self-esteem, if you will, depends very much on what people are thinking about you, what people are saying about you. Okay, that's as opposed to an honor culture where self-esteem is very much internalized. You have, through your own record of achievement, you build your own self-esteem, and that is pretty secure. You don't care what people are saying about you. That is not going to determine how you feel about yourself. Well, back in these days, it was very much a shame culture environment, and the idea now is what Agamemnon has done is take away Time from Achilles in the form of this war prize, this woman Briseis, and he has done this publicly, and all the other warriors are gathered when this happens. And therefore, how can Achilles expect to be respected amongst his peers and have them say great things about him if basically he's being punked out by Agamemnon? And this is a huge affront because kleos not only does it determine what people are saying about you right then and there when you are alive and walking around, but kleos also serves as a form of immortality. Okay, these are the stories that will be told generation after generation about the heroes long after they are dead. Now, again, this crisis is threatening the ability of Achilles to be remembered after he is dead as the formidable warrior that he obviously is. So this is kind of a big deal. This is not a case where Agamemnon's taken away Achilles' girlfriend and he's going to go run away in his tent and pout about it. This really does cause a psychological crisis from Achilles' perspective. And we have to ask now, why did Agamemnon do this? Achilles is the best warrior Agamemnon has. Why is he ultimately threatening this relationship between the two? And of course, the reason is that Agamemnon has had to give up one of his concubines, one of his war prizes. He had taken as a concubine Chryseis. And unfortunately for Agamemnon, Chryseis had a father, Chryses, who was a priest of Apollo. And Chryses goes to the Greek camp, and this is just before the action of the Iliad opens up. And Chryses asks that Agamemnon return his daughter. And Agamemnon says, no, she is my time, she is my prize. And Chryses then says, well, you know, I'm a priest of Apollo, and Apollo is the god of disease, so you can put two and two together if you don't help me out here. And Agamemnon refuses to budge. And then, of course, Chryses will pray to Apollo, and Apollo will unleash a plague on the Greek camp. That will go on for some days, until finally a council is held, and it is determined Agamemnon needs to give up his prize. He needs to give up his concubine. Well, now Agamemnon feels the pinch of losing Time, and therefore losing Kleos, losing the esteem of his comrades. So he's pretty peeved about that, and perhaps not thinking clearly, he decides, well, I'm going to, restore both my Time and my Kleos. I'm going to grab a concubine from Achilles, that's the Time part, and I'm going to restore my Kleos, my glory, by basically punking out this warrior, this most formidable of warriors. So again, this is kind of a petty attitude on the part of Agamemnon, and it will result in Achilles going on strike. And not only that, but Achilles will enlist the aid of his divine mother, Thetis, to have Zeus cause more pain for the Greeks. Indeed, and here we see a 19th century painting, a version of this moment, where Thetis is appealing to Zeus as a suppliant. She is asking Zeus to cause the Greeks pain so that they will keenly feel the loss of Achilles. And Zeus agrees. He agrees that the Trojans will be given the upper hand on the battlefield for a while. He makes it clear that the fate of Troy is already sealed. That city will fall to the Greeks. But Zeus is willing to kind of draw things out a little bit longer and, again, along the way, cause the Greeks pain and make them really miss Achilles. And the idea is that Achilles will once again have some of his kleos restored by the Greeks thinking and saying favorable things about him, wishing he were there on the front lines alongside them. So what I need to point out about the Iliad and what it makes it such a compelling story is the fact that Homer, who was a Greek origin, Homer really writes very good Trojan characters. He really writes sympathetic and appealing Trojan characters. The most appealing of them all is, of course, Hector. Paris we don't have patience for. Paris, of course, has allowed his sensuality, has allowed his appetites, has allowed his short-sightedness to basically threaten and jeopardize the health and welfare of his entire civilization, of his entire city. Paris is balanced, though, with his more somber and sober older brother Hector. And Homer makes it clear that yes, there is a little bit of time and kleos that drives the motivations of the Trojan warriors. They are warriors after all. This was a broad-based warrior culture that we're dealing with. But Homer adds another dimension and notes that Hector and the other Trojans are also fighting for survival. Well, we do get a very compelling moment in the story where Hector is interacting with his wife, talking to his wife Andromache, and there is their young infant son Astyanax, and Hector makes it clear that he feels compelled as a prince of Troy to set the positive example, to be out there on the front lines, and Andromache is begging him not to go, that to use his royal status to find a rear echelon job for himself to do rather than lead from the front. And this is something that Hector cannot allow to happen. He is going to be on the front lines with the troops, setting the example. Now, Paris, on the other hand, Paris spends a lot of time in bed with Helen, and Hector often has to scold him to get him to do the right thing, to get him to do his duty as a prince of Troy. And again, Paris is a very problematic character, and there is quite a contrast drawn between the two, the sober and disciplined Hector and the sensualist Paris. Now, Hector, of course, is going to do his duty no matter what, even if it kills him. But for the time being, the Trojans see a change in their fortunes, and as Zeus begins to intervene and inspire the Trojans, the battle begins to go badly for the Greeks. And it goes so badly, in fact, that Agamemnon, realizing he has made a grave mistake, decides to try to persuade Achilles to return to battle. Now, he knows that Achilles doesn't want to hear anything directly from Agamemnon. So one evening, Agamemnon sends 3 very prestigious Greek warriors to the tent of Achilles to try to get him to return. Agamemnon sends Odysseus, who again was renowned as a very clever and fast-talking Greek hero. Phoenix, who was Achilles' tutor when Achilles was growing up, and Ajax the Greater. I will refer to him as in his anglicized name, Ajax the Greater, who next to Achilles was the most formidable warrior on the battlefield. And each one of these 3 guys has a pitch in which they try to convince Achilles to return, but Achilles is having none of it. And Achilles even goes so far, in a very stunning part of the Iliad, Achilles will even go so far as to question the whole value of time and kleos as a foundation for the society in which they all live, this warrior society. And basically Achilles makes the argument, a very valid argument in light of what has just happened, that what good is time and kleos if in the blink of an eye some knucklehead like Agamemnon can come and take your stuff, and then people will start talking trash about you? What kind of system is that? So Achilles again is offering us this insight as to the flaws of having this kind of shame-based society. Now, we've looked at the Greeks, we've looked at the Trojans, and we should not neglect the gods. And the gods do often play a direct role in a lot of the action here, both from their headquarters on Mount Olympus there, or actually on the battlefield. There are several moments in the battle where gods take part in the action, and Aphrodite gets a cut on her hand. Ares actually gets a wound to the stomach. Apollo gets challenged by one of the Greek warriors. And here I should point out there is a lot of partisanship going on here, where we have Hera and Athena and Poseidon firmly on the side of the Greeks. We see Apollo and Aphrodite lining up alongside the Trojans. So this Trojan War has even split the Olympians into different factions, and each will do what they can to promote the interests of the side that they are backing. Anyway, in Book 11, remember there are 24 books total, so now I'm about halfway through the Iliad. In Book 11, Zeus, through a messenger, tells Hector that on this day you will have victory until sunset. And that's all Hector needs to know. And this begins a part of the Iliad that's referred to as the longest day, because it takes up quite a few of the subsequent books, subsequent chapters in this epically long battle scene. But the summary is that Hector and the Trojans rush towards the Greek camp, and the Greek camp consists of a wall, a sort of palisade that surrounds their beached ships not far from the ocean. And the goal of the Trojans is to burn up the ships and get into the Greek camp and wreak havoc. And Hector almost succeeds, and it is during the early phases of this epically long battle that Agamemnon is wounded. Diomedes, one of the Greek heroes, Diomedes of the war cry, he's often called, Odysseus, all these great Greek warriors are wounded in battle, and the only one left standing is Ajax the Greater, who again, next to Achilles, was considered the best of the Greek warriors, and he fights to prevent the Trojans from breaking into the Greek encampment, but he is hard pressed to hold the line. When we do get to sort of the final phase of this longest day, I now have to introduce you to Patroclus, who was Achilles' dearest friend, his best friend. And by the time we get to Book 16, at the end of this epic battle scene, the Greeks are so hard-pressed that Patroclus appeals to Achilles, saying, if you don't want to get involved in the fighting, and I understand why you don't want to, at least let me put on your armor and go out there, and maybe the Greeks will think that you have rejoined the fight, and they will draw inspiration from that. And so Patroclus gets Achilles to say yes, and Achilles lends the young lad his armor, and Patroclus goes charging off into the battle. And Achilles, when he gave Patroclus the armor, said, "Kid, only go so far in pushing the Trojans back. Do not approach the walls of Troy. It's too dangerous. Just get the Trojans out of our encampment and give us some room to breathe." But of course, Patroclus, who now is wearing the armor of Achilles, he's young and he's fired up. And things go well for him, because all the Greeks do take renewed vigor from seeing what they think is Achilles rejoin the battle, and they begin to push the Trojans back. But therein lies the problem. Carried away with his success, Patroclus does approach the walls of Troy, giving you a sense that the Trojans really are retreating to the safety of the interior of the city. And this is where Patroclus is going to be killed by Hector, although Apollo throws Patroclus off balance so that Hector can administer the death blow. And this is the turning point, because Achilles loved this kid. And now to have Patroclus killed by Hector is going to set Achilles off on a whole new trajectory. He's going to forget his anger at Agamemnon, and instead the bloodlust will rise. He wants Hector dead. And from this point on, it is Achilles who in many ways becomes inhuman. He really does give himself over to bloodlust and battle rage. And he will ultimately not only rejoin the battle, but he will do so with an unimagined vigor. And prior to Achilles ultimately moving into battle, there is this very poignant scene where Thetis appears and knows fully well that Achilles, enraged at the death of his best friend, is going to rejoin the battle, but she does take a moment to remind him that and say, look, you've got two possible destinies. If you stay here and kill Hector, you are fated to die soon after. But if you do sail back to Greece, you will live a long life. It'll be a quiet life, and maybe people won't talk about your deeds, but you will marry and have many children and live the peaceful, quiet life. And Achilles, of course, says, I don't care about the quiet life. I want Hector dead. And so Thetis is resigned to accept that her son will die at Troy. Now we're fast forwarding to book 22, when we do see the epic combat scene between Hector and Achilles. Now do note that the motivations here. Hector, the reluctant warrior, knowing that he has to do what he has to do out of a sense of duty. Achilles, something less than human. His bloodlust has driven away any sense of compassion, any sense of balance, and he can only focus on killing Hector. And of course, Hector knows fully well that going up against Achilles is not going to end well for him. So he wants some sort of assurance that his body will be returned for a proper burial to his family, and Achilles refuses this. And then, of course, the tragic climax of the Iliad, when Hector is mortally wounded and once again begs Achilles, don't defile my body, and Achilles just tells him, your body is going to rot. The birds and the dogs will feast on your corpse. And then, of course, as a final insult, he pierces the ankles of Hector's corpse and ties the body to the back of his chariot, and then begins to race around the walled city of Troy. And of course, we might imagine poor Andromache being one of the spectators along the wall, watching in horror at what has happened to her husband. Not only has he been killed, but his body, as long as it is refused burial, his body is being defiled and will not be able to find peace in the underworld as long as it is held hostage by this maniac Achilles. So again, you have this exultation and exhilaration of victory displayed by the Greeks, and we can only imagine the mourning and the grief that is being experienced by the population of Troy. Even after killing Hector, though, this is not going to be enough to bring Achilles back to an emotional framework that is considered stable. He refuses to bury Hector's body. He has refused to bury Patroclus's body because he just cannot stand to be apart from his dear friend. So there's a difference in motivation here. He's refusing to bury Hector out of spite. He's refusing to bury Patroclus out of love. But things come to a head when the ghost of Patroclus actually appears to Achilles and asks him, can you bury me, please, so that I can pass into the underworld? And Achilles does comply, and there is this whole book 23. A lot of it is taken up with elaborate funeral games, sort of athletic contests in honor of the dearly departed. And Achilles will actually sacrifice a number of Trojans of royal blood over the burial mound of Patroclus. So again, the bloodlust is still with him. Now, we see that Achilles, once he's buried Patroclus, he still is technically in mourning for his friend. He doesn't shave, he doesn't bathe, he doesn't even eat. And he continues to drag around Hector's corpse, specifically around Patroclus's new tomb. And it gets too much. I mean, this is disconcerting if you are one of the Greeks observing this behavior, but it becomes too much even for the gods, who decide to intervene. And it is the gods who will orchestrate a type of reconciliation that will conclude the Iliad on a somewhat positive note. Events unfold when Zeus will send Thetis to speak to Achilles, and then Zeus will send his messenger Iris to ask Priam to go to the Greek camp, to the tent of Achilles, and ask Achilles directly, face to face, to ransom Hector's body. So the messengers are sent, and both parties agree to a face-to-face meeting inside of Achilles' tent. Of course, Hermes will guide Priam, protect him, because you can't have the king of Troy gallivanting around the Greek encampment without being disguised and shrouded with divine aid. And Priam is able to get through to the encampment to Achilles' tent, and there, again, Priam will get down on his knees and beg Achilles, beseech him, in the name of Achilles' own father, Peleus. This is quite a touching type of strategy, because, of course, Achilles notes that Priam, an old man, has just lost his son, and Achilles knows that he too soon will die, and Peleus, his father, back at home, now an old man, is getting ready to lose a son. So there's a connection that is formed immediately, and they do begin to bond over this shared grief, and they actually weep together for their losses. Of course, Priam is weeping for Hector and Achilles for Patroclus. So again, bonding over grief begins the reconciliation process. And Achilles waxes philosophical for a moment there, knowing that Zeus and the gods themselves often tinker with human beings by bestowing on us all sorts of sorrows that will mark our lives, and that we have to just bear it. We have to stand up to the adversity and carry on the best we can. So he offers this in the way of comforting Priam. And ultimately, after a meal together, it will be Achilles who will gather up Hector's body and physically carry it to Priam's wagon, which is waiting there. And then Priam will depart, and Achilles will, at this point in the story, in the end of Book 24, recognize his humanity and recognize and accept his mortality, knowing that he too soon will perish. And in a way, we might imagine a sense of relief going through the mind and heart of Achilles, knowing that he is reconnected with his full humanity, and that he had this chance at redemption in offering up this generous gesture of returning a son's body to his bereaved father. And then, of course, Achilles, as a kind of a final flourish, assures Priam that there will be no Greek attack on Troy while Hector's funeral services are being carried out. And this, of course, will span for about 11 days. So Achilles promises a type of truce. And the Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector. And very eloquently, I will quote the last lines. Having piled the grave mound, they went back and met together and held a glorious feast in the palace of Priam, the god-ordained king. Thus they buried Hector, tamer of horses. And that is the end. A book that really touches on the human experience on so many different levels and from so many different angles. I really can't recommend it highly enough.